One of the biggest hang-ups that I hear people express about thinking of becoming a Christian, or Christians who are just thinking about their faith and are struggling with some things, one of the repeating ideas is this question of the Bible and science, the Bible and evolution, and particularly what gets wrapped up in this is the Bible and Adam and Eve. And the question is were Adam and Eve real people? Did they actually exist, or is this a myth like other myths? And so there are a number of ways to view this. And what I want to do here is not go into depth in all of them, but just outline the various ways that people tend to view Adam and Eve as they're represented in Scripture. The first view is the view that sees Adam and Eve as the first human beings. This is the traditional view, the view that has existed in the history of Christianity for the longest time. If you grew up in the church, this is probably how you've heard it expressed. And this is the view that is probably the most natural read of the text of Genesis 2, and it's why it's the traditional one. However, those who hold it want to see the timeline of the creation of the world, that God created the world and created the rest of the living beings, but created human beings distinctly and particularly out of the dust, miraculously, as it was described in the story in Genesis 2. The second view is what we might call Adam and Eve as myth. And there's a number of ways that people might view this. One is a more cynical view that sees the story of Adam and Eve as just one origin story among any other origin story. It's a myth among myths. So there's not a lot of respect for the story as far as truth is concerned, though it may be viewed as historically valuable. But basically this is a made-up story from primitive people who are trying to make sense of how we got here. But there are also other Christians who hold this view and see it as myth as not so much of a bad thing, but they see myth as a legitimate way to convey truth, just in a different way. It's not the kind of truth you would see in the New York Times in a journalistic or a modern historical way, but myth conveys deeper reality. They would say that the author of Genesis wouldn't have even thought in historical terms like we think today in modern scholarship, but they understood what myth was. They understood conveying deep truths through stories, and they wouldn't have asked, did this actually happen, in the way that we asked that. So still respecting the story, but viewing it in a different way. A third view is one that sees Adam and Eve as real people, but perhaps not necessarily the first human beings. And this view is oftentimes both a literal depiction of the story in Genesis 2, but tries to be compatible with modern views on evolution, even evolution of the species. So this view would see Adam and Eve as human beings who perhaps evolved from lower life forms, but were set apart at a certain moment in history, that at some point or another, God decided to put his seal, his stamp, his image upon this species of human beings and set them apart as distinct. And Adam and Eve were either the first of those set apart or were the representatives of the rest of mankind. And I just want to leave us with this, that on the one hand, if you find evolution, modern science to be a stumbling block to your faith, you should know that there are Bible-believing Christians who don't find modern views on evolution and Scripture to be incompatible. So there's room for conversation there, and I want to encourage you not to let that be a stumbling block. But I also want you to know, on the other hand, that if you hold the traditional view, that this does not make you unscientific. There are people who are serious about both science and Scripture on all the various sides of this conversation. So I hope that if the dynamics of this idea of the historical Adam are a point of tension for you on either side, that you not feel obligated to see this as a crisis of faith or crisis of science, but that you can see this as an ongoing conversation and one that you can have as a Bible-believing Christian and coming from that place of faith.